It's great to be here. I have to admit, this is my very first trip to Nebraska. And I am just so thrilled to be here. It's fantastic. Um, I know that from the short time that I've been here talking with Christina and some of you and just sort of looking around here, that all of you, I think, celebrate the wonder and the beauty that is nature here in Nebraska. The trees, the mammals, the fish, the birds that make up natural history here. And at the same time, I'm sure all of you are aware of the kinds of problems that are encountered as human activities begin encroaching more and more on our wild spaces and on the presence of nature. You've done many things that I've been learning about to try to ameliorate this, especially with respect to trees. Everybody in the country knows that the Arbor Day Foundation, of course, is housed here in Nebraska, but also the work that all of you are doing at the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, to me, has been an inspiration in terms of the kinds of thinking, the kinds of feeling, the kinds of connecting that all of you put together in terms of keeping trees active and maintained and sustainable in your communities. And I have to say that that work with trees falls on welcome ears and eyes for me. This is me when I was about 6 years old or so. My favorite pastime as a kid was climbing trees, and this has been maintained in the profession that I chose, which is tropical rainforest ecology, trying to understand the complex tapestry that a rainforest is. And of course, as every rainforest ecologist and scientist knows, that there's more than just the biology. There's the importance of the structure of trees in our lives that make them so compelling, so interesting, and so important to us. And not only the shape of trees as trees, but of course we see trees everywhere if we're sort of attuned to what a tree is. When we fly over trees, or when we fly over rivers, as I did today coming into the Lincoln Airport, I can see that rivers are really nothing more than just trees that have fallen down and been flattened out and filled with water. We also know that we have trees in our own bodies, that are lungs, the organ that takes in air, inspiring us, and exhales, really are shaped as trees as well. Let me figure out how to go backwards here. Our neurons at the backs of our brains, those are trees also. In fact, the nerves themselves are called dendritic, or dendrons, from the Greek word for tree, dendron. So these dendrites are what make us think, what provide us with cognition, what provide us with emotions in our brains. And what I think is one of the most striking pictures of trees, or sort of metaphorical trees, are these trees, so to speak, in the human heart. This is a picture of the human heart, and this vasculature, these blood vessels, really to me mean trees, that we carry them in our hearts. Well, we may carry them in our hearts, but as we know, with the increasing urbanization of our society, the increasing mechanization, the increasing distance that humans are from trees, from forests, from the very source of what provides us with oxygen, with lumber, with medicines, with foods, we have become isolated and disconnected from trees. And this, I think, causes us to really realize that we need to think about ways that we can overcome this distance. And what I'd like to talk to you tonight really draws upon the theme of how we, as people who are concerned with trees, need to walk a line between hope, that hope we see when we see a new tree being planted, and despair, that despair that we see or feel when we see a piece of rainforest that is no longer intact. And the response to this, trying to walk this line between despair and hope, for me, has been a response that entails the metaphor of tapestry. And I call upon this little poem, this tiny 17-word poem by Rabindranath Tagore. The tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever joining, ever breaking and joining. And so what I'd like to do tonight with all of you is to talk about sort of tree conservation, tree awareness as tapestry, not the blending together of our outlooks, of our ways of knowing, of our professions and of our actions, but rather keeping those threads of our disciplines and our ways of knowings intact, but weaving them together so that they create something that is complex, something that's connected, something that's useful, something that's strong, and something is beautiful, very much like a real tapestry. And I'd like to sort of divide my talk into three parts. The first part will concern my own research as a forest ecologist. That is, that the observations and the experiments and the modeling work that I've done to understand that the forest itself is a tapestry with interweaving motions, dynamics, and participants of pollinators, of fruit dispersers, the connections of fungi and plants and soil, that the forest is truly a tapestry. Second, I'd like to describe some of the efforts that I have made with my students and my colleagues to try to weave the ecological values that we have come to understand that belong and emerge from forests and weave them together with the other values of society, in particular the aesthetic values of society, the faith or spiritual values of society, and the social justice values of society, so that those interweaving ecological values and societal values can make a strong tapestry. And third and finally, I'd like to think about and pose to you who weaves this tapestry, who has a place at the web or the loom of forest conservation and appreciation of nature. So let's start with the forest tapestry that I am lucky enough to observe as I travel to the tops of the trees of Costa Rica and Washington State, where I do my research. I can see from my arboreal perches that indeed the forest is a tapestry, that there are threads of motion, of dynamics, of the constituents of the biodiversity of the forest that creates a tapestry of ecosystem function, which when intact can continue really very well over the eons. But when disrupted, when disturbed, when that tapestry is worn down by human activities, does not function as well. And what I'd like to do is to, since I can't bring you up to the forest canopy of Costa Rican rainforest where I work right now, is I'd like to just show you a little snippet of a video that was taken as part of a National Geographic television special called Heroes of the High Frontier, which will let you see what I do in Costa Rica and Washington State in terms of getting up into the forest canopy. Well, how many people would like to take a winter vacation with me to Costa Rica to climb some of those trees? Yeah, that's what I like. So if you could come with me this winter to go down to my field site in Costa Rica, in a place called Monteverde, Costa Rica, and if you were sitting next to me on one of these branches, you would experience what these canopy plants and animals are in the canopy and why I'm so compelled to study them. It's because that microclimate of the forest canopy is very, very different from what we would be encountering on the forest floor, which is dark and humid with very little wind. But when we go up into the forest canopy, there's much more sunlight. There are greater extremes of relative humidity and temperature. There's a lot more wind up there. And because of that different microenvironment, and because of the architecture of the canopy, and that it's made of these tubes of solids with these pieces of these three-dimensional volumes of empty space, there are a completely different coterie of plants and animals that live up in the forest canopy than what we would encounter on the forest floor. And so in the tropics, such as here in Jamaica and in the temperate rainforest where I work in Washington State, you would see really every sort of square centimeter covered with vibrant mosses and bromeliads and orchids and ferns and lichens that grow and live their entire lives, or most of their life cycles, up high above the forest floor. There are literally thousands of species that are what we call epiphytic. They are epiphytes growing upon plants but not deriving any nutrients from the plants. They don't put their roots in the tree, nor do they put their roots down to the forest floor, but rather they get their nutrients and their water from atmospheric sources, from nutrients that are dissolved in rainfall and in mist. And they are very efficient at incorporating these nutrients, intercepting and hanging on to these nutrients in the forest canopy. When they die and fall to the forest floor, these are circulated around the ecosystem as a whole. So these epiphytes are really very important in terms of not just being in the forest canopy themselves, but interacting with other elements of the rainforest flora. That is, these are threads that are woven into the fabric of the rainforest itself. And I have spent the last 30 years or so with my colleagues and students trying to understand the ecological roles of these diverse plants. One of the things that we've learned is that they are extremely important in terms of intercepting atmospheric nitrogen. About 60% of the nitrogen that comes in the form of rain and mist are captured by these canopy-dwelling plants. We also know that these living plants in the forest canopy actually, as they die and decompose in place, actually create what we call an arboreal soil, or canopy soils. And these canopy soils are quite similar to what we find on soils on the forest floor. They support very diverse invertebrate faunas in which birds can forage and eat these insects that live in the canopy soils. One of the remarkable discoveries that I made in the forest canopy is that when you peel back these living plants and you look into these mats of soil, very often you'll find these systems of vascular plant roots. Now, these are not roots that belong to the epiphytes, but rather they belong to the host tree. The tree actually puts out roots from its own branches and trunks, these adventitious roots that go into the soil, that take advantage of the nutrients that are sitting there on their own branches. So it's really sort of like these epiphytes are paying rent to the landlord of the host trees that support them. They're functional roots. We've done experimental studies with them and found that they do, in fact, take up nutrients from the soil that is engendered by the plants that sit perched up there, deriving support from the host trees. Again, another example of the interweaving, the shortcut in nutrient cycling, the interweaving of nutrient cycles of epiphyte to tree. We also know through some studies that we have done in Costa Rica that these epiphytes are very important in terms of providing resources for birds, separate and in addition to those of the host tree. They provide food, they provide nectar, they provide moss material to camouflage the nests for their young. And so in Costa Rica, during the 3 months that we did a study comparing the bird foraging visits to epiphytes versus host trees, we found that there was actually a third of the foraging visits went to epiphytes rather than the host trees themselves. So we began understanding that these canopy-dwelling plants are not just sort of a extra thing that grows on tops of trees, but they're actually keystone elements. Even though they're small in biomass, they have a much larger footprint in terms of their ecosystem function. Well, in learning about this over the years, I began realizing then that these are an important part of the ecosystem, an important part of that forest tapestry. What would happen if we disturbed them? What would happen if we removed these epiphytes? How long would it take for them to grow back? I thought this was a very simple question to ask back in the early 90s when I set this up. My students and I simply removed mats of epiphytes, and we wanted to know how they would grow back. We predicted they would grow back very quickly and that they would grow back from the side, sort of encroaching like grass on a sidewalk. Well, the first year after we stripped these mats of epiphytes, came back, took pictures, nothing had grown back. Year 2, nothing. Year 3, 4, 7, 10, 12, 13 years before we saw any growth at all. And when we started seeing growth, it was from the bottom of the branch. We saw this green scuzz on the bottom of the branch. The top was as naked as a baby bottom. It was just incredible. And it took another 10 years for that green material, those mosses and algae, to grow back on top of the branch, after which we began seeing colonization by little bromeliads, little orchids, and so forth. So the lesson to us was that, number one, it grew back very slowly, and number two, it didn't grow back as we had expected. It started growing back from the bottom up. So these seemingly sort of easy questions in canopy science were actually quite unexpectedly more complex than we thought. And I'll just show you this. This is always reminding me that, once it's gone, it's gone. And maybe some of you can relate to this, and if you're really lucky, you might get some growth starting at the bottom and sort of starting to grow back up. So keep this image in mind because we'll be talking a little bit about moss regrowth later on. Well, those first experiments in terms of disturbances within the canopy and the length of time that it took to recover. That is, that these epiphytic communities, although they look very lush, are actually not very resilient, that it takes a very long time for them to grow back, was mirrored by what I began seeing around me as I started working in the rainforests, that there was a tremendous amount of human activities that were having negative effects on forest canopies and forest ecosystems. Mining, for example, and washing away the soil, the conversion of primary forests to agricultural purposes, forest fragmentation. And the most extreme example of this is what I would observe as when a piece of rainforest would get turned into a pasture, and the farmer might leave one or just a few what we call relic trees, trees that grew up in the primary forest, but which had been isolated because of the human activity of creating pasture. And one of the questions that I've been looking for answers for ever since, sort of this question of looking at this for about 10 years, is really trying to understand whether or not those ecological functions and the diversity of plant life that I documented in the primary forest trees would persist after these trees have been isolated. That is, will birds cross that ocean of pasture to pollinate or disperse the fruits of that isolated relic trees? We don't have the answers to that yet, but we're looking into the answers as our future research in Costa Rica. But those kinds of questions about the effects, the negative effects of human activities on canopy biology, on forest ecology, on individual trees and whole forests, began getting me thinking about what I as a scientist should be doing in addition to asking these little tiny biological, ecological questions in rainforest canopies. And I sort of had a conversion about 15 years ago or so, thinking about how I as a scientist might contribute to helping out those trees and forests and rainforests in a way that might go beyond my simply publishing little articles in little scientific journals and giving talks to other scientists in conferences. That is, some of the work that many of you are doing with the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum and associated projects, conveying to people the importance of trees, the values of trees, even though you may live in a place like this, being aware that trees and other facets of nature are important for our existence. What could I as a scientist do? So I began thinking of ways I could do this. My lab students and I started laughingly thinking about, well, what if we had Treetop Barbie? And we said, well, that would be great. That would inspire young girls to realize that tropical rainforests are interesting to somebody like Barbie. And so we approached Mattel and called them and asked them whether they'd be interested, and surprisingly, they weren't. And so I said, fine, we'll do this ourselves. So now what we do is we go to Goodwill stores, we buy used Barbies, we have volunteer seamstresses to make little Barbie outfits, and most importantly, we have a little pamphlet that discusses the importance and the diversity of canopy-dwelling plants in the Pacific Northwest. So Barbie then has become our ambassador to young girls and boys and aunts and uncles who buy Treetop Barbie about the cause of rainforest science, the cause of rainforest conservation, the need to knit together the recreational values of Barbie with the ecological values of forest canopies. We've tried ground support. Ken, not a big seller, so he's sort of discontinued. But what I'd like to do now, laughter aside, is to tell you what that interaction with Treetop Barbie taught me, which is that it is possible to take the ecological values of trees that I just discussed with you, nutrient cycling, provision of resources for birds, a stabilization of forest soils. How do we knit those together with other values of science? And in terms of Barbie, we were able to say, well, people love to play with Barbie, so let's just knit those values together with ecology. And what I'd like to do now is to talk about how my students and my colleagues and I have gone about knitting together not only the recreational values of Treetop Barbie with the ecological values of rainforests, but how we might go ahead and use the existing aesthetic values of trees, the spiritual values of trees, and the social justice values of nature to knit together a tapestry that is connected, that is useful and strong and beautiful. So let's start with the aesthetic values. How do we knit those together with the ecological values of trees and forests? Well, this is really dead easy. I mean, trees and forests have inspired artists of all kinds for eons. People have made poetry and dances and music that was inspired by the forest. And the approach that I took was to create a set of what I call canopy confluences. Confluence means to flow together. So what I wanted to do was have the ecological values that forest ecologists have found about forest ecosystems with the values that artists, the perceptions that artists have of trees and forests, and how they might communicate those amazing aesthetic values. So what we did was we gathered together a group of forest ecologists with some artists, some dancers, musicians, poets, creative writers. We brought them together for a week in a remote forest area. We put up platforms in the forest canopy. We taught everybody how to climb using our mountain climbing techniques. And we had just incredible results in terms of the kinds of understandings that artists brought to the forest with their amazing ability to communicate the aesthetics of forests. And I'll just mention a couple of things that came out of this. We had art gallery exhibits. We had just amazing sort of outputs. But we had one group called Capacitor. This was a modern dance company in San Francisco. The director, Jody Lomas, called me and said, "I'd really like to make a dance about rainforest, Dr. Nadkarni. Could you help me?" And I said, "Yeah, that would be fantastic." So we went down to Costa Rica to my study site, she and all 7 of her dancers. We spent 10 days in the forest canopy together. After 3 days, they had all taken off their clothes and were dancing nude in the forest. They came back to San Francisco and they had created this really wonderful dance called Biome. We got a small grant from the Toyota Corporation that allowed us to perform this in San Francisco and in Seattle. And what we found then was that it was really the dance community that was our audience. It wasn't scientists, it wasn't conservationists, it was people who wanted to see a dance. And secondarily, they were able to learn about and be excited about and become inspired by the content and the images that Jody was able to make with me as a scientist and an artist collaborating together. So weaving together my science knowledge content of the forest with her remarkable ability to create movement and music and video that went along with this very inspiring dance was to me a really great testament of the fact that we can weave together the ecological values of trees and forests with the aesthetic values of dance. On another note, we also brought musicians to the forest canopy, a wooden flute player, an oboist, a guitar player, and best of all, and most sort of compelling in all, I think, was Duke Brady, one of my students who's a rap singer. So he began making canopy rap songs. I recorded some of those and actually played them to when I would go out to primary and secondary schools in my community. And it was always Duke's rap songs that really got the kids excited about tropical rainforests. And so learning from that, I decided to start a program called Sound Science, in which I hired a professional rap singer named Caution. He's up here in the corner. We gathered 40 at-risk youth from middle schools in Tacoma, Washington. They came down to our campus. Caution and a biologist went out every morning with them to go into the forest. They would Caution would pick up a stick and make a rap song about it. And the kids then would in the afternoons, we'd go into the sound studios. And they made up their own rap songs with the help of Caution. They're using their own beats to create a CD. At the end of the week, we were able to send them home to their friends and family with a CD of their interpretation, their perception of the forest through the medium, through interweaving that culturally important movement called rap music and hip-hop music. So I think this was a very effective way of mingling those two traditions, those two sort of different, seemingly very different cultures of ecology and rap music to produce something that was meaningful to these kids. I think fashion is a really important part of our society. Now, as an ecologist, and probably as many of you who work in your gardens would probably say, fashion? But actually, fashion is important. When we chose to put on what we wore tonight, you knew you would be seeing your friends and your colleagues, so you might have put something on a little special. And we use fashion as humans to display how we want to portray ourselves. And so for that reason, I think fashion can be a very important aspect of applied aesthetics. And I began thinking about ways I could interweave the values of the ecological threads of the forest where I work with the field of fashion. This was my first attempt. It's a moss cape. It looks really good, but it sheds a lot. And so I stopped being invited to parties because I would sort of leave scraps of moss all over the patio. But this is the solution that I found. To take an image in the forest canopy, this is an image of Piper aretum. Piper is, it's actually related to Piper nigrum, which is black pepper, what you put on your scrambled eggs in the morning. It grows in the forest canopy of the cloud forest. It's a very beautiful plant. So I took that image and printed it on fabric, and then I worked with a tailor to design and sew, and I'm actually wearing this jacket today. You can see, and the kicker is that it comes with a little hang tag. And on that hang tag is a description of the biology and the conservation of that species. So if you're wearing this little jacket, if I'm wearing this jacket and I stop at Starbucks and Christina says, gosh, Nalini, that's a really nice jacket, then I have the opportunity to tell her that, yes, this is Piper aridum. It grows in the canopy of Monteverde. It's related to the black pepper that you put on your scrambled eggs this morning. And if you'd like to work on its conservation, you could join the Rainforest Action Network. And so that is the wearers of this line of clothing then becomes a vector for education and conservation on a very easy basis. And so that is one of the projects I'm working on now, which is to weave together this thread of aesthetics, whether it's music, whether it's dance, or whether it's fashion, to try to connect people to the important ecological values of trees and forests. So let's look at spiritual values and think about how we can weave together spiritual and religious values with ecological values of trees and forests. And I have to say, I read somewhere a statistic that stated that 80% of the humans on our planet self-identify as religious or spiritual people. That's a lot of our world's population. I think it's probably more than people who would identify themselves as conservationists or environmentalists. And so it seemed to make sense to me that we might bring together spiritual and religious values with ecological values. And again, just like with aesthetics, this is really dead easy. Hermann Hesse, in a beautiful essay he called On Trees, wrote this: "Nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than a beautiful, strong tree." And so I think there is sort of an automatic association of spirituality and trees, which I wanted to sort of explore. And the way I decided to explore this was to not come across as a scientist trying to shove the ecological values of trees, carbon sequestration, and so forth down the throats of religious people, but rather to read their holy scriptures and to derive from what they believe in, what they already value, as a way of understanding the importance of trees. So I picked up the Old Testament, I opened the first page, and there I learn about two very important trees. What are they? Tree of life, tree of knowledge of good and evil, right there on the first page. Oh, wow, this is easy. Had no idea it would be this easy. So then I made it even easier for myself. I downloaded the Old Testament from the web and did a search for the words tree and forest. And I found that there were 328 references to trees and forests. And being a scientist, I had to categorize them into different categories. So I found out the proportion of these verses that had to do with symbolic and aesthetic use, analogies to life and God, practical use like food or adorning temples, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, or tree biology. And I did the same thing with other holy scriptures. With the Book of Mormon, of course, living in Utah, that was very important. Looking at the Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shavat, which is a celebration of the New Year for trees. All of these major world religions have a tremendous lot to say about the importance of trees in terms of spirituality that has been documented in their own holy scriptures and traditions. So after about a year of doing these readings, I put together a sermon called Trees and Spirituality. And I started knocking on doors of churches and synagogues offering to give a sermon about trees and spirituality. And it was the Unitarians that allowed me in first, not surprisingly. But after that, they sort of passed me around to the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Catholics, Jews, Buddhists, and so forth. And so now I've given about 40 sermons in different churches. And I have to say that I have never had a confrontational encounter of creationism versus evolution. It's not about a scientist shoving his or my ideas onto people who may not believe or value them, but it's rather saying, I'm a scientist who is so interested in understanding the value of trees that I want to go to what you believe, what you have documented, what you have written in your own holy scriptures. And this has proven, I think, again, to be an effective way, a non-confrontational way of knitting together the different values that we sustain and finding commonality. So we've seen that recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual values are something that we can easily interweave. And I'd like to just sort of end this section of my talk with talking about social justice values. And this really came from an ecological question, trying to involve people who are incarcerated in ecological work. This is an ecological problem that exists in the Pacific Northwest. It turns out that there's sort of a group of people that are stripping mosses, epiphytic mosses, off of branches and trunks of trees to sell to the horticulture trade, to make moss baskets, to pack bulbs in mosses. So when you go to a florist and you want to buy an arrangement, you'll often see mosses sort of in the flower pot. Well, almost all of those mosses come from stripping mosses off of old growth trunks and branches of the old growth temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest. Now, what do we know about how long it takes for these to grow back? It takes a long time. Remember that bald guy I told you, remember? So 30 years minimum for this to recover. So this is not a sustainable industry. This is not something that should be going on, especially since we also know that these mosses and other epiphytic plants are important, if not keynote members of the rainforest tapestry. So I felt, again, asking myself, as a scientist, what can I do to solve this? I can't stop the traffic itself. I can't stand in front of every tree in every national park and national forest, stop those moss collectors. But maybe what I could do is learn how to grow moss, learn how to farm moss, to relieve the collecting pressure on wild populations. And there's no knowledge of moss horticulture. People really haven't figured out how to grow mosses, so it required some experiments to find out which mosses grow fastest, what's the best way to grow them. I didn't have any students at the time to do that, and I thought, well, maybe I could use inmates as partners in this research endeavor. They have a lot of time, they have a lot of space, you don't need sharp tools to work with mosses. And so I started knocking on doors of state prisons in Washington State, where I was living at the time. And you can imagine the responses were at first, like, what? Who are you? And do you have the right place here? But as it turned out, there was a wonderful, very forward-thinking superintendent at one of the prisons, a minimum security prison, the Cedar Creek Correction Center. And he said, well, it can't hurt. Maybe it'll keep the guys busy. Bring on the mosses, fine. So we did. My students came in with bags of mosses. We taught the guys how to tell the difference between the species. They helped build these racks. And after 18 months of taking, one set at a time each month to find out which species were growing fastest, everybody was happy. I was happy as a scientist because I had the answers to the questions of which species of mosses grow fastest. The superintendent was really happy because these guys were interacting better. They were better social interactions. They were getting some skills for the job market for when they leave the prison. And of course, the inmates loved it because they were being involved with something that was kind of bigger than themselves. They were allowed to interact with me and with my students. They were doing something that was helping the earth. And as it turned out, this was very important. It was, not surprisingly, something that actually improved their behavior. And so they asked me, are there any other projects? So I began bringing in, on a monthly basis, my fellow faculty to give talks about science and biology and conservation and sustainability in the prison situation. We started the Sustainability in Prisons project. Some of the projects that evolved from those lectures are still going on, and in fact have spread across the state and now across the country. Things like starting an organic garden. We brought in beekeeping people to teach the men how to raise bees to make honey for the prison table. We began a recycling center out of an old shed, which began actually saving the prison money because there were fewer trips to the landfill that they had to pay for. We also began working with conservation groups. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife had an ongoing project to rear the Oregon spotted frog, which is a state and federally listed species. They had been working with the Woodland Park Zoo and the Portland Zoo, but we were able to convince them that the men in these correction centers would make great partners in doing that. And as it turned out, they did a great job. They had the lowest mortality value. They had the highest survivability of any other captive rearing facility in the state, which was really marvelous. We've partnered with the Nature Conservancy for the men at Stafford Creek Correction Center to raise 300,000 plugs a year of 17 species of endangered prairie plants for ecological restoration work at Fort Lewis, Washington. The women's prison, we're working with them with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to learn how to rear the Taylor checkerspot butterfly, also a federally listed species, from egg to larvae to adult. So all of these really connect then, weave together then, the needs of the ecological restoration and conservation community with the capacity and the ability and the heart of those inmates who are disconnected from nature, disconnected from their families, disconnected in many ways from society, to create something that is tapestry, that is connected, that is complex, that is beautiful and strong. We've been doing this same thing in Utah. When I moved to Utah 5 years ago, I began similar work in Utah. We've been doing some research on bulrush cultivation that the inmates are participating in. The men are building kestrel boxes as part of a national program for with the American Kestrel Society. They'll be building the boxes, setting them up on jail property, and then monitoring the success of these boxes over time. We've also been involved with a sage grouse habitat conservation project with the Salt Lake County Jail. This is sort of our iconic bird in Utah and other parts of the Intermountain West. And the women inmates are now growing up plugs of 20,000 plugs a year of sagebrush that will be outplanted to burned areas of the sagebrush areas that will improve habitat for these remarkable birds. And this is not only at our prison in Utah, but each of these red dots presents a sort of a growing spot of prisons and jails that are part of this effort to weave together the needs of the conservation community with the offerings of the inmate communities. So all of these projects have really been very successful in terms of media, certainly. We have been written up in magazines from Science all the way to Playboy, and we've been very proud of the sort of the media that has surrounded this. But a few years into this project, I began realizing that I was not reaching those men and women who were in deep incarceration. We were working mainly with those inmates in minimum and medium security areas because those were the ones that were best behaved, the ones that we were allowed to interact with. And men and women who live in solitary confinement, and there are over 100,000 men and women in the United States who are confined in these very small 9 by 12, 9 by 14 foot concrete enclosures for 23 hours a day. We couldn't get to those. We couldn't bring science lectures to them or bring frogs or soils or plants or butterflies to them. And so we began thinking about ways that we might be able to bring nature to them, or at least nature imagery to them. And basically we were sort of taking off on the idea that we've learned about hospital patients, also a very sterile, nature-deprived habitat, that when patients look out at the view of a window with a tree versus a view of a window of a concrete wall, those people who see trees actually recover faster. There's less stress, less anxiety, and a greater capacity to heal. Well, it seemed like if we tried to apply that in a prison situation, especially in solitary confinement cell blocks, we might have the possibility of bringing down stress, bringing down anxiety, bringing down aggression, and reducing violence. I made contact with an amazing supermax prison in Eastern Oregon called the Snake River Correctional Institution. They sort of bought into this. It was kind of a long story, but they finally invited me in and said, well, let's give it a try. It can't hurt. They installed a projector in one of the exercise rooms, a room that's slightly bigger than their cells, in which the men routinely go 1 hour a day to just exercise. So we added for half of the cell block, the design was for half of the cell block, we put in this video projector and showed the men films, nature films, for that hour a day they were in there. For the other half of the cell block, we didn't show them film. After a year of this, we went back and we did surveys and interviews of the men and found that, in fact, they self-reported that they felt calmer, they felt less irritable, they felt less anxious, and they could, when they watched these films, and they could carry back those feelings back when they went back to their cell. And this was corroborated by the staff as well. But what was really kicker was what we saw in terms of the effect of these nature videos on their behavior. For those men who saw the nature films, they committed 26% fewer violent infractions than those that did not. They were the same risk level, the same guards, the same control room, but those who watched films experienced or committed fewer violent infractions. So although this practice of showing nature films to men in solitary confinement is not going to fix that practice or change really the course of what we have as mass incarceration in this country, we have come to understand from this study that in fact the proximity, the weaving together of even nature imagery for these nature-deprived populations can prove to be better in terms of their behavior and their outlooks. So I hope that I've shown you then that we can incorporate the ecological values of trees and forests into a variety, these three that I chose to talk about tonight, but also that there are a variety of other societal values that others of us can take advantage of, other threads that we might choose to weave into the ecological values. And I invite you to think about how you might use any of those values, or values that you might be aware of that could be knit, could be woven together into the ecological tapestry that we think of as forest conservation. I'll just mention in terms of my own work that I love doing these kinds of projects that I've described to you myself, but I think what's really important also is to try to pass this on to the next generation of scientists. And so I've just received a grant from the National Science Foundation to start what I call the STEM Ambassador Program, which is all about recruiting and guiding and training other scientists to carry out public engagement events with non-traditional public audiences in the venues of where those populations are. And this is a collaborative piece of work that's funded by the National Science Foundation and a number of other collaborators across the country. And I just want to say, I think that although very often scientists are viewed as people who stay in their lab or stay in their field site or don't really care about the rest of the world, I think that is beginning to change, that more and more scientists that I encounter are asking us to help them make these connections, to make these interweavings, to be at the loom of carrying out interactions with the public. So I will sort of finish my talk with thinking about how do we go about weaving this tapestry of conservation and who is at the loom. And I would like to say that, well, I've shown you four people who are at the loom. Barbie is one of them. The inmates that I discussed in our prison program, those are other weavers of that tapestry. The dancers and other artists can certainly participate, and Caution, the rap singer, an unlikely but perhaps but extremely welcome member or thread for this kind of work. And I would suggest, too, that all of you who are associated with the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum are already sitting well at that loom of forest conservation. The work and the projects that have been described to you by Christina and those who have been participating in the amazing work that the NSA does, I think you guys are just perfect examples of how you are knitting together community values into the values of preserving, maintaining, and expanding the presence of nature in the lives of people here in Nebraska. So I want to say I'm really grateful for the work that all of you do. I want to just sort of end my talk with an admission of the despair that I sometimes feel when I carry out my own research and when I carry out my public engagement projects. And you probably have sort of sensed I'm pretty upbeat about all of this stuff, and I am a pretty positive person. But sometimes I feel, perhaps this is the election season I'm thinking of right now, that the obstacles that all of us face when we think about making change, about having a contribution to movement in the right direction, of sensing that things are kind of hopeless because they just don't move when you try to push them. I think all of us, myself included, have felt that frustration that sometimes does border on despair. Despair that might make us walk out of the forest and say, I can't do any more, that's it. But I believe, and I would like to share with you this belief, that if we look elsewhere, if we don't focus on that stable trunk, that static being that is the trunk of a tree, but instead come to the canopy and look up there, and on a slightly windy day, you will see movement in those leaves. Belong to the trunk of the tree, but they are not the trunk. They are the leaves, and they have the capacity to move. And I began thinking about this, and I began in my own kind of weird scientific, artistic brain to think about how I might record that movement. And so I tied little brushes to the tips of twigs, and I dipped them in green paint, and I held up a canvas, and I waited for the wind to move those twigs, those movable, dynamic twigs across the paper. And sure enough, they made a little painting. After 2 minutes, and I timed it, after 2 minutes, this lovely piece of art was created by the tree. This was a signal of dynamicism, of non-static. And I thought that was really beautiful. But then I thought, well, how far is it moving? And so I summed up all of the lengths of the segments, and I added them together, And I added them up, and I multiply that by the number of twigs per branch, the numbers of branch per tree, and I expanded that to the number of minutes per day and days per week and weeks per year. And so I was able to come up with an estimate of how far a single tree can move in a year. And I would like you to guess. How far? Not the trunk of the tree. The trunk did not move. But how far, when you add it all up, did all those twigs move over the course of a year? 10 million. 186,540 miles per year, which is the equivalent of a movement of 7 times around the Earth. And so when I calculated this, silly as it is, I mean, it is kind of a silly exercise, but what it meant to me was that an entity that seems so static, that seems so immovable, that seems so stubborn, that seems so counter to whatever it is that we're trying to change together, if you look at the right place, if you allow it the right time, if you open your mind to a different way of measuring something, then we can say that indeed a tree can circulate the Earth 7 times in a year. And so with that, I want to thank you for this evening of sharing ideas about weaving together the many values of trees and forests with the many values of society. And again, I thank you for the work that you do to keep that tapestry vibrant, complex, connected, useful, strong, and beautiful here in Nebraska. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
We have time for questions, if anyone has a question for Nalini. And you have to talk into the microphone or we can't hear you.
I'm a little science-oriented, so I was interested in more detail on the tree that went 7 times around the Earth. Species, size.
Well, I didn't quite hear what your question was.
The species, size, other things about the tree that went 5 times around the Earth.
Oh, yes. That was a Douglas fir. It was about 100 feet tall. So it had a branch system. And what is super duper interesting is that, I think is interesting, is that when you do this, you try this out on different species of trees, they have different styles. It's like a Picasso versus a Monet. And so your vine maple will produce something that looks very, very different from a Douglas fir. And so I can envision an art gallery, sort of displaying this amazing set of portraits, so to speak, that these different species of trees have created. So I urge you to do that. You do need some wind to make that work, but it's a really very easy thing to do. Yeah, I guess that's not a problem here in Nebraska.
I know what everyone's going to be doing tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Our son spent a semester in Costa Rica.
Ah, great.
And brought back some samples of various kinds of wood, most of which were just gorgeous. And you showed photos of areas of the forest which have been cut down. And it seems to me that perhaps we ought to be looking at the economic value, because people are cutting down the trees so that they can grow crops which have a greater economic value.
Right.
And cocobolo, for example, has an enormous economic value as lumber, but there isn't much of it. So I'm wondering about how the economics, at least one of the candidates for president, would respond to an economic argument.
Right. Great question. And the question was about whether we should be using economic values as an incentive for well, at first, just to understand why people might be cutting down trees, and that's clearly the case. When you look at forestry here in the United States, we've had, how old is the Forest Service? 100 years old, right? It's a very old practice, and we also have a sort certain number of species that are used economically. So we know a lot about those particular species in terms of their needs, their requirements to be grown in plantations or grown at a large scale. Not so much so in the tropics. Historically, there hasn't been as much of a sort of a history of understanding the forestry, the needs, the requirements of these commercially very important or much desired tree species. But that is beginning to change as there becomes to be more research and more emphasis on commercially valued timber. So now, for instance, in Costa Rica, you see cedrela plantations. This is a tree that grows relatively quickly. It can be grown in plantations, and so people are sort of moving to that model. It's not an answer, because when you start growing things in monocultures, inevitably, especially in the tropics, you very often run into problems with insects and fungal disease and so forth. I think what's really also interesting is a conversion that's going on in places like Monteverde, where I work, excuse me, where there's a growing amount of ecotourism, where the economy has shifted from cattle farming to ecotourism over the last 25 years. And so now what's going on is that farmers are realizing that they can't make much money at all raising dairy cattle because the fertility of their pastures has just plummeted. But if they let it grow back, then these birds start coming back, and then tourists come to watch the birds, and suddenly this becomes a livelihood for their children, who are now natural history guides in Monteverde. So I think there are many things that we might consider as alternative sources of income that may not have directly to do with the actual tree plantation or tree species, but alternative ways of interacting with the environment. You're welcome.
Did I see a hand over here?
Are you, excuse me, are you seeing some changes like in the Ozarks that had been deforested sent over 100 years ago, basically, and then planted in pines? Now the pines are disappearing because they don't do well in that particular climate, and the hardwoods have come back in to Mark Twain National Forest. In other areas, like the caves are starting to regrow in the Ozarks that had stopped growing.
Yeah, so are you asking, is that going on in Costa Rica, or is that, yeah. Again, not so much. It's still less developed. We don't have that history, that understanding, I think, that we have here in the temperate forest that we manage. I think we're getting there. I think we are making an effort to do that, but it's still very much at a sort of, I would say, a more primitive level or a more basic level of development. But I think one of the things that you bring up is that now that we have seen these patterns of succession, of development, of species replacement over centuries, we can start understanding the dynamics of forests. And I think that is the key in terms of the fact, I mean, it helps me understand why we've done such a poor job of forest management in the tropics, because the generation times of trees are so much longer than our own, that to see changes, to carry out experiments, even forestry experiments, we have to wait a very long time to see what the result is. If you look at Pacific Northwest forest management in Washington and Oregon, for example, there have been some very forward-thinking changes in terms of forest management. Now, if you're managing a forest, you have to leave 3 live trees, 3 snags, and 3 downed logs as what they're calling legacy structures in clear cuts. We don't know whether that's really going to make a difference in terms of the diversity of wildlife or nutrient cycling or seed success, but that's what we're projecting based on our best knowledge of ecology. So we haven't even harvested the results of our experiments, and yet we're prescribing these very different management techniques. And I think they're sound myself. I think they're well-founded in ecology, but we actually don't have the data that really tell us yes or no whether those are the right kind of management techniques to impose.
I want to thank you for coming and enlightening us in this room. But I want to also recognize that the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum has grown considerably in a number of sites all over the state, in our villages, in our parks, schoolyards, so many places now. The Nebraska Statewide Arboretum has a presence. And some of those people are here tonight, but probably lots and lots of people that are a part of Nebraska Statewide Arboretum are not here, and we need to recognize those. But I commend you for coming to share your story.
Thank you very much. And I am inspired by the work that you do, and I don't know the half of it because I've only spent a day here with Christina, but just the whole model of having this dispersed model of community forests in so many places across the state is incredible to me. Most arboretums, as you know, are these big monster chunks of ground that people have to sort of travel to, and if that's not where they live, I don't see how they could have the same connection that they do to the forest that where you've been working in your communities. So a marvelous, and certainly I can only imagine the kinds of challenges that you have to overcome with that. But the benefits, I think, that accrue to that model, I think, are tremendous from what I've seen. So I am inspired.
We have time for one more question.
You've had the benefit of studying in Monteverde, Costa Rica, the cloud forest for, I think, like 30 years. And for me, I kind of think of there's sort of like an elephant in the room, which is global climate change and its influence on that forest. And you probably, as much as anybody, have been able to watch and see that. You didn't really address those kinds of things, and I'm just kind of curious if you have any insights on subtle changes that you've seen in your history of studying there.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, if Christina had given me 2 hours, I could have talked about some research that my colleagues and I have done. But let me just address your question. Yes, having been in Monteverde since 1979, I've been there and attentive to, well, back in the 70s, 80s, nobody even knew about climate change, so we weren't paying so much attention to it. We saw climate and microclimate as this sort of stable thing. But now, of course, we understand from global climate change models, from just a tremendous amount of research that, in fact, tropical montane cloud forests like Monteverde are among the most vulnerable ecosystems that exist on Earth. The life zones are sort of compressed because in elevation, but also the presence of mist and fog that characterizes cloud forest ecosystems is really up for grabs right now. We know that there's this cloud lifting hypothesis that is when you have the warm air coming off the ocean as you move up the mountain, it condenses and you get this this wind-driven mist that hits the mountain. And as we get rising sea surface and land surface temperatures, that cloud bank is going to keep moving higher and higher until, in some cases, it just bypasses the mountain altogether. Well, being a canopy scientist and being someone who's keenly interested and now worried about epiphytic plants that, as I said, get their water and nutrients from this mist and fog that continually bathe the upper part of these mountains, what's going to happen to them? Now, I'm pretty old. I mean, I am pretty old, and so I won't really be around and active when the full brunt of climate change happens. So I decided to take an experimental approach where I took epiphyte mats, these mats of epiphytes that are independent of their host, and move them down to trees and strap them onto trees lower on the mountain where they naturally get less mist and fog. That is, I was mimicking what would happen with an extended dry period, which is what is predicted for cloud forests. And I did this for 18 months, and I monitored the number of new leaves, the number of whole plants that died, and just the well-being, the sort of ecophysiological well-being of these plants. And what we saw was that for our 4 target species, all of them declined when we moved them down, when they were subjected to global climate change conditions as predicted 20, 30, 40 years in advance. We also did transplant experiments within the cloud forest just to make sure that it wasn't the moving them around that made the difference, and we found there was no effect of that. So that was just one experiment that we carried out that showed us that these canopy-dwelling plants are in fact vulnerable to the kinds of predictions or the kinds of weather that global climate change scientists are predicting for Monteverde and other cloud forest systems. So that's one piece that was a very direct question, do they change or not? The other kinds of observations that are now being collected by a number of scientists in Monteverde involve, first of all, monitoring the microclimate and the climate, and they are finding, in fact, vast differences, much longer dry seasons than what they used to. But they're also seeing species of butterflies, species of lizards, species of frogs, and species of birds that are now much higher on the mountain than they've ever been documented before. So there's this slow movement, and it's actually not so slow, of displacement, of movement of these species that used to occupy these lower, drier habitats that are now moving up there. We don't see that, of course, so much in the plants yet because, as we know, the trunks don't move, but we will probably be, there's anticipated that we will be seeing changes in at least the herbs and forbs and some of the shrubs in the near future. So stay tuned to that, and Monteverde is a really fabulous place because so many people have done research there for so long that it really is one of the very best tropical cloud forest research sites with documentation of climate as well as biota.
Thank you.